Would you believe that in what looked like a perfect family, one child lived like an outsider, and no one noticed until everything fell apart? The story begins in a home. Everyone admired successful parents, a bright biological child, and a well-behaved, adopted one. On the surface, they seemed complete, sharing laughter at dinner and a life that looked full. But beneath that surface were silences no one dared to acknowledge. From the very beginning, differences existed, subtle yet undeniable. The adopted child tried twice as hard to be accepted through grades, behavior, and every word spoken. They learned to read their parents' expressions, constantly guessing whether they belonged that day. Meanwhile, the biological child lived freely, confident in a love that never needed to be earned. Whenever something happened right or wrong, the parents' attention instinctively turned to their biological child first. No one said it aloud, but it was obvious. Family dinners, meant to feel warm, slowly became places where small differences grew praise for one, silence for the other, a natural hug, and an invisible distance. The adopted child realized they could not compete with blood ties, so they chose silence and worked even harder. Yet the harder they tried, the clearer it became that some things could never be earned. The most painful thing was not rejection, but being treated as if they didn't exist at all. And within that illusion of peace, the first cracks of the family quietly formed, small, nearly invisible, yet powerful enough to one day shatter everything. None of them knew that the child seen as the weakest would be the one to change the family's fate. And when the truth finally surfaced, only one question remained: is family defined by blood or by what we are willing to do for each other? From a very young age, the adopted child sensed something no one in the family would ever admit: they didn't truly belong. No harsh words were spoken, no obvious cruelty was shown, yet it existed in the smallest details that were impossible to ignore. As a child, they often wondered why they always had to be more obedient, more understanding, and more well-behaved. While the biological child could cry, throw tantrums, or make mistakes, and still be comforted, the adopted child learned to stay silent, to swallow their emotions, as if that were the condition for being allowed to stay. Whenever guests visited, the parents proudly spoke about their biological child with glowing eyes. But when mentioning the adopted one, their tone became neutral, sometimes reduced to a brief introduction. No one realized that these seemingly harmless moments were quietly building a deep sense of abandonment. During important occasions like birthdays or academic achievements, the difference became even more visible. The biological child received loud praise and special gifts, while the adopted child often got nothing more than a nod or a short acknowledgement. Over time, they stopped expecting recognition and instead focused on avoiding mistakes, just to not become a burden. The most painful part was that they couldn't blame anyone, because everything appeared reasonable enough to go unquestioned. The parents didn't hate them, but they didn't love them the same way they loved their biological child. And that silent difference kept the adopted child standing on the thin line between being family and simply being someone kept out of obligation. There were nights when they stared at the ceiling, wondering if anyone would truly notice if they disappeared one day. That question had no answer, but it was enough to teach them that they had to be strong on their own, because no one else would do it for them. And from those years of quiet inequality, a silent yet resilient person was formed, someone who would one day make the entire family question everything they once took for granted. While the adopted child learned to survive through silence and constant effort, the biological child grew up in an entirely different world, one where everything seemed to revolve around them. From an early age, they were used to being the center of attention in every situation. At family dinners, gatherings, and conversations, they were naturally placed in the spotlight. The parents never realized that these seemingly harmless actions were slowly creating a widening gap between their two children. When the biological child achieved something small, it became a story, told repeatedly, praised as something remarkable. But when the adopted child accomplished something similar, the reaction was far more subdued, as if it were simply expected. Over time, the biological child began to believe they deserved all this attention. They didn't need to try as hard, because no matter what, they were always the first choice. When they made mistakes, they rarely faced serious consequences, as the parents would explain it away or minimize the issue. They called it protecting their child, but in reality, they were unintentionally teaching them that responsibility could be avoided. In small arguments, the biological child was rarely asked to apologize first. Instead, the parents' gaze would shift toward the adopted child, silently suggesting that they should be the one to give in. This not only hurt the adopted child, but also fostered an unnoticed sense of entitlement in the biological one. They grew accustomed to always being right, or at least never wrong enough to face consequences. What began as confidence gradually turned into carelessness, then into a subtle selfishness they themselves didn't recognize. To outsiders, the biological child still appeared charming, confident, and full of potential, but internally essential values, like empathy, responsibility, and fairness, were not properly developed. And this quietly planted the seeds for much bigger mistakes in the future. No one in the family realized that by constantly placing one child above the other, they were not only hurting the other child, they were also leading their own biological child down a dangerous path where boundaries blurred and vital lessons were never learned. The signs of favoritism did not explode into one obvious event. Instead, they accumulated slowly like tiny scratches on glass, almost invisible at first, but over time enough to shatter everything. In that household, no one openly said they loved the biological child. More yet, their reactions in everyday situations spoke louder than any confession. When both children shared a problem, the parents would listen longer to the biological child, ask more questions, and show clearer concern. With the adopted child, they listened but rarely went deeper, as if the story did not need to be fully understood. These small differences repeated so often that they became the new normal of the family. A new outfit would be bought immediately if the biological child wanted it. But for the adopted child, the answer was often later or not necessary. When the biological child was tired, the entire family adjusted to let them rest. When the adopted child was exhausted, it was seen as part of the responsibility they were expected to handle. Even family movie nights reflected this pattern. Choices revolved around the biological child's preferences, and if the adopted child disagreed, they were simply the one expected to adapt. No one forced them into silence, but the situation taught them to give up their place voluntarily. Favoritism also appeared in how the parents spoke about the future. When referring to their biological child, they used words like talented, full of potential, destined to succeed. For the adopted child, the praise was safer, hardworking, well-behaved, reliable. Positive on the surface, yet quietly limiting what they could become. Over time, the adopted child not only felt the difference in treatment, but began to see themselves through that same lens. Someone who must constantly prove their worth, but is rarely seen as equal. The most unsettling part was how gentle everything seemed. Too subtle to be labeled as injustice, yet too clear to be denied. And it was these seemingly minor signs of favoritism that quietly shaped the emotions, thoughts, and ultimately the destinies of both children. One growing up believing they would always be chosen, and the other believing they must always earn their place. In a family where recognition never came naturally, the adopted child quickly learned that if they wanted to be seen, they had to do more than what was expected. No one ever said it outright, but repeated experiences taught them an unspoken rule: effort was not a choice, it was a condition for survival. From their early school years, they set standards for themselves, far beyond what anyone demanded. Grades didn't just need to be good, they had to be exceptional. Behavior didn't just need to be appropriate, it had to be flawless. Words didn't just need to be polite, they had to make others feel comfortable. They observed how their parents reacted to the biological child and quietly wondered, what do I need to do to receive that same look, even just once? So they began studying longer hours, helping more around the house, yielding in every disagreement. Each time they achieved something, they waited for a small moment of acknowledgement, a compliment, a nod, or simply a proud glance. But most of the time, what they received was silence, or a brief remark that quickly faded away. Gradually, they learned not to expect anything yet that didn't make them stop. Instead, they tried even harder, as if just a little more effort would finally change everything. There were nights they stayed up late to finish assignments, not out of fear of bad grades, but out of hope that the next day their parents might see them differently. There were moments when they took on extra responsibilities at home without being asked, simply to prove they deserved to stay. But the more they tried, the clearer it became that some invisible boundaries could not be crossed, boundaries defined by blood ties. This realization did not break them immediately. Instead, it transformed them into someone relentlessly persistent. They began to measure their entire self-worth by what they could accomplish. If they succeeded, they felt they existed. If they failed, they felt they had no right to be there. The pressure didn't come from anyone else. It came from within, nurtured by a long absence of recognition. To outsiders, they appeared admirable, hardworking, responsible, always striving. But inside, they were battling a deep emptiness, a fear that no matter how well they performed, they would never be loved the way they longed to be. Yet through this constant need to prove themselves, they became stronger, sharper, more perceptive, qualities no one in the family realized they had unintentionally shaped. They didn't know that the child who kept striving for recognition was quietly building a strength powerful enough to one day change everything. And when that day comes, the question will no longer be whether the child is worthy, but whether the family is worthy of everything the child has done. Having grown accustomed to being favored and placed at the center of everything, the biological child gradually began to see the world in a very different way, one that even they didn't realize was changing who they were becoming. At first, it showed in small ways. They no longer felt the need to try very hard, because no matter the outcome, they would still be praised or at least protected. When they performed poorly on a test, they knew their parents would find external excuses rather than hold them accountable. When they made mistakes at home, they understood that staying quiet or showing a bit of regret would be enough for everything to pass. The repetition of these situations slowly taught them that consequences were something that could be avoided as long as someone was there to shield them. From that point, a subtle shift took place. Effort was no longer seen as necessary, but as optional, and more often than not, they chose the easier path. At the same time, they observed the adopted sibling, constantly striving, and began to feel a vague sense of discomfort. It wasn't hatred, but rather the uneasy feeling of being compared to a standard they didn't want to meet. Instead of learning from it, they started to downplay those efforts. When the adopted child achieved something, they might casually say, "It's nothing special," or "Anyone who works hard could do that," as a way to reassure themselves that they weren't falling behind. Deep down, however, they knew they were relying on an advantage. They hadn't earned the unconditional love of their parents. That quiet awareness pushed them toward a more dangerous line, beginning to take advantage of that favoritism. At first, it appeared in small actions, such as subtly shifting blame so their parents would assume the adopted child was at fault. They didn't need to lie outright. They only had to remain silent at the right moments, or add details that favored their side. Because their parents were used to trusting them, they rarely questioned further. This reinforced the belief that they could control how others perceived situations. Over time, these actions became more deliberate. They realized that as long as they maintained the image of being the good child, they could avoid responsibility and even shift the burden onto someone else. In many situations, the adopted child became the one who had to explain, take responsibility, or at least be suspected first. The most concerning part was that none of this happened in a sudden burst. It developed gradually, nurtured by the family environment itself. No one explicitly taught them to be selfish or manipulative, but the way they were treated created the perfect conditions for those behaviors to grow. In their parents' eyes, they were still the child to be proud of, the one worth protecting. But what the parents failed to realize was that each time they stepped in to shield them, they were reinforcing a dangerous habit, the habit of avoiding responsibility and placing themselves above others. And over time, that habit would not only harm those around them, but also lead them into much bigger mistakes that no one would be able to hide or fix for them anymore. The early conflicts between the two children were at first nothing more than small everyday clashes, a careless remark, a misunderstanding, an argument over something seemingly trivial. But what gradually made everything more serious was not the conflicts themselves, but the way the parents responded to them. Whenever something happened, almost instinctively, they always sided with the biological child. Sometimes they didn't explicitly say the adopted child was wrong, but their expressions, tone, and the way they handled the situation made it clear. When the biological child became upset, the parents quickly comforted them and tried to ease their emotions, while the adopted child was expected to be understanding and give in. As a result, these arguments were never resolved fairly. They always ended with one person staying silent, and that person was almost always the adopted child. At first, the adopted child tried to explain to present the truth as calmly as possible. But over time, they realized their words did not carry the same weight. Even when they were right, they were still the one asked to apologize first as a way to keep the peace. Meanwhile, the biological child grew accustomed to not needing to listen or understand others because they knew they would always be protected. This imbalance not only created distance between the two children, but also shaped how they viewed justice and responsibility. The adopted child learned to suppress, while the biological child learned to assert. And the more the parents repeated this pattern, the more they reinforced these roles. There were situations where it was clear that the biological child was at fault, yet the parents still found ways to minimize it or redirect the issue as if admitting fault would damage the image they had built. This left the adopted child not only feeling unfairly treated, but also questioning their own perception. They wondered if they were overreacting, if staying silent would make things easier. Eventually, they chose silence not because they agreed, but because they understood that arguing would change nothing. That silence over time became an invisible barrier between them and the family, a distance no one tried to close. Meanwhile, the biological child grew more confident in their position, to the point of not realizing that their actions were hurting someone else. They didn't see the consequences immediately because everything was being shielded. But that very protection prevented them from learning accountability. The most concerning part was that the parents believed they were protecting their child when in reality, they were doing the opposite. They were not only hurting the adopted child, but also depriving their biological child of the chance to truly grow. What once were small conflicts between two children had now become the foundation for deeper fractures. Fractures that would one day erupt into a full crisis when no one could continue to stay silent or avoid the truth any longer. The biological child's major mistake did not happen suddenly. It was the result of a series of small choices accumulating over time, choices that had previously been overlooked or protected. This time, it began with a seemingly harmless decision. They wanted to prove they could take control of things, that they didn't have to live under anyone's shadow. But having never truly learned to face consequences, they entered the situation with confidence that lacked foundation. At first, it was just a small lie. To avoid being scolded, an impulsive action to maintain their image in front of friends. And like before, they believed that if things got out of hand, their parents would step in to fix everything. That belief pushed them beyond safe limits without realizing it. When the problem started to surface, the consequences were no longer minor. It could have been lost money, legal trouble, or a situation that seriously damaged the family's reputation. For the first time, it couldn't be resolved with a simple explanation. Yet instead of confronting the truth, the parents reacted in the way they always had. They tried to cover it up. They didn't dig into the root cause, didn't demand full accountability from their biological child. Instead, they immediately shifted into protection mode. Quiet phone calls, carefully reworded explanations, omitted details, all aimed at preserving the child's image. And when they needed a plausible explanation to make the situation seem acceptable, their attention instinctively turned toward the adopted child. No one directly accused them, but vague suggestions and half-spoken statements began to form an alternative narrative, one where the adopted child was somehow involved, or at least the one expected to explain. This wasn't the first time they had been placed in such a position, but this time the severity made everything different. The adopted child realized that if they stayed silent like before, the consequences might fall entirely on them. But if they spoke up, they wouldn't just be confronting the biological child. They would also be confronting their parents, the very people whose approval they had always tried to earn. This was no longer a simple choice between right and wrong, but between protecting themselves and maintaining their role as the understanding one. Meanwhile, the biological child, still wrapped in familiar protection, didn't fully grasp the seriousness of the situation. They only sensed that things were becoming more complicated, yet still believed their parents would eventually fix everything. That belief prevented any sense of urgency to change or admit fault. and the parents, in their effort to keep everything stable, pushed the truth even further away. They failed to see that every time they hid the truth, the problem didn't disappear. It only grew deeper, more complex, and harder to control. What began as a single mistake had now turned into a spiral, pulling everyone in a spiral of denial, avoidance, and shifted responsibility. And at the center of that spiral, the adopted child stood at a turning point: continue staying silent, and accept being misunderstood, or break that silence and face whatever consequences might come. As the story began to be distorted to protect the biological child, the adopted child slowly realized they were being pushed into a familiar role, only this time far more dangerous: the one who takes the blame. At first it was subtle, suggestive questions, looks, that led others to misunderstand explanations, missing key details. The parents never directly accused them, but the way they recounted the situation to others quietly placed them in a position of involvement. As the story spread, those gaps were quickly filled with assumptions. Suddenly, they were no longer just possibly involved, but increasingly seen as responsible. What made everything heavier was the biological child's reaction. Instead of speaking up to clarify, they chose silence, whether calculated or simply a habit of avoiding responsibility. Even they couldn't be sure. But the consequence was clear. With every passing moment, the truth remained unspoken. The false narrative grew stronger. The adopted child stood in the middle of it all, feeling something both familiar and unfamiliar. Familiar because it wasn't the first time they were expected to be the understanding one and accept the loss. Unfamiliar because this time the consequences went beyond a simple apology or emotional hurt. It could affect their reputation, their future, and how others saw them. They began to question, why had their past silence been interpreted as agreement? Why did their willingness to yield make others believe they could endure everything? Intense conversations as the parents tried to resolve the issue. They stuck to their usual approach, finding the quickest, least damaging way out for the biological child. And within that logic, having the adopted child take the blame seemed like the easiest solution. They didn't say it outright, but phrases like, "If you explain this, it will be easier," or "You're always understanding, you know what to do," carried an unspoken pressure. It was no longer a request. It was an expectation disguised as trust. The adopted child clearly understood that if they agreed, everything would quickly settle, the family would return to normal, the biological child would avoid major consequences, and they would resume their familiar role. But this time they couldn't ignore the cost. If they accepted the blame, they would carry a reputation that wasn't theirs. If they refused, they would break the image of the understanding child their parents relied on. This inner conflict made them realize something crucial. The problem wasn't just the biological child's mistake, but the family's long-standing pattern of placing burdens on them that never belonged to them. And for the first time, they began to consider changing that role. Not out of rebellion, but from the understanding that if they continued to stay silent, they would lose not only the truth, but also themselves. Meanwhile, the biological child remained on the other side of the story, protected by silence and carefully constructed explanations. They could feel the pressure building, but not enough to force them to step forward and face it. And the parents, despite moments of hesitation, were not ready to break the pattern they had always relied on. Everything seemed suspended in a fragile balance, a balance maintained by one person continuing to endure so that others wouldn't have to change. But any balance built on injustice cannot last forever. And the moment the adopted child decides to stop taking the blame may be the moment that changes the entire story. The peak of all the tension finally arrived on what seemed like an ordinary evening, when the entire family sat down to clear things up. But from the very first moments, the adopted child could sense that this conversation wasn't truly about finding the truth. It was about reinforcing a decision that had already been quietly made. The atmosphere in the room was heavy. Every word was carefully chosen, yet beneath it all was a clear direction: protect the biological child at all costs. The parents began with long explanations, trying to minimize the seriousness of the situation. They emphasized that everyone makes mistakes and that what matters is keeping the family stable. But the more they spoke, the more they avoided the core issue: who was actually responsible. And then, as if by an inevitable shift, their attention turned to the adopted child. There were no direct accusations, but phrases. Like if you take responsibility, things will be easier, or you've always been the most understanding one, said everything. This was no longer a discussion. It was a decision presented as a choice, leaving little room to refuse. The adopted child sat there listening, feeling the full weight of the moment. This wasn't the first time they were expected to sacrifice for the sake of peace. But this time the cost was far greater. If they agreed, they would carry the consequences of a mistake that wasn't theirs, not only within the family, but in the eyes of others. If they refused, they would shatter the image of being the selfless one, risking disappointment or even anger from their parents. In that moment, memories of past silences came rushing back, times they chose to yield, to stay quiet, believing their sacrifice would make things better. But now they saw something clearly. Every time they stayed silent, the boundary moved further until they became the only one bearing the burden. Meanwhile, the biological child remained there, not entirely comfortable, but still not stepping forward to tell the truth. They might have felt the pressure, but still believed their parents would resolve things the usual way. Their silence, whether intentional or not, became part of the decision itself, and the parents, seeing no direct opposition, became even more convinced they were doing the right thing. The moment stretched on until the adopted child realized that if they stayed silent again, everything would be decided for them. For the first time, something shifted inside, not fear of rejection, but a need to protect themselves. When they finally spoke, their voice may have been quiet, but it was enough to break a silence that had lasted too long. They didn't need to shout. They simply stated the truth clearly. They were not responsible, and they would not take the blame. That single statement changed the entire atmosphere of the room, exposing everything that had been hidden. The parents froze, not because they didn't understand, but because they never expected this refusal. The biological child could no longer remain comfortably silent, as the truth now stood openly before everyone. It was the moment when nothing could return to what it once was. The parents' decision to stand by their biological child, though long prepared, now became undeniable, not based on truth, but on choice. And that moment marked a turning point, not only in the relationships within the family, but in how the adopted child saw themselves. They were no longer the one who accepted everything to keep the peace, but someone willing to face consequences to protect the truth. From this point on, the story was no longer about who would be protected, but about who was willing to take responsibility. After that intense confrontation, the atmosphere in the house changed in a way that was obvious, yet no one wanted to acknowledge it. The warm family dinners disappeared, replaced by long silences and avoided eye contact. The adopted child understood that their decision had broken a long-standing order, one where they were always the one to give and the one who kept everything stable. And when they refused that role, the fragile balance of the family immediately began to collapse. The parents didn't openly express their anger, but their behavior had clearly shifted. Conversations became short, distant, and carried an invisible tension. They no longer turned to the adopted child for opinions or shared thoughts, as they once did, as if their trust had quietly been withdrawn. In their eyes, there was a disappointment that was hard to hide, not because the child was wrong, but because they hadn't done what was expected. This made the adopted child realize a painful truth. The acceptance they once had wasn't entirely for who they truly were, but for the role they had maintained. Once that role disappeared, their place in the family no longer felt secure. On the other side, the biological child also changed in their own way. They were no longer as comfortable as before because for the first time, they faced a situation where no one could fully shield them. Although the parents still tried to protect them, the incident had created a crack in how they were perceived. They began to feel a new kind of pressure. The pressure to explain themselves, to take responsibility, even though they didn't yet know how. However, instead of confronting the truth directly, they chose distance as a way to avoid facing something they weren't ready to accept. That distance only made the relationship between the two children feel more unfamiliar than ever. There were no longer simple interactions or casual conversations, only a heavy silence between them. In this environment, the adopted child began seriously considering leaving, not out of anger, but because they understood that staying in a place where they were no longer seen fairly would only make things worse. The decision didn't come suddenly. It formed gradually through each day, and each moment they realized they no longer belonged as they once did. They began preparing quietly, organizing their thoughts, exploring possibilities outside, and most importantly, preparing themselves mentally for a major turning point. When they finally expressed their intention to leave, the parents' reaction was not understanding but surprise, mixed with frustration. They hadn't realized things had gone that far. In their minds, this was just another conflict that could be smoothed over with time like before. But this time was different. The adopted child was no longer trying to ease the situation, they were facing it with a clear decision. The conversation that followed was no longer about right or wrong, but about whether they truly belonged in this family at all. And when that question was raised, no one could give a convincing answer. In the end, the child left not during a dramatic argument, but in a heavy silence, one that carried everything that had never been said. It was the moment when the family would never be the same again. Not because of one single decision, but because everything that had built up over time had finally reached its limit. And as the door closed, none of them fully understood what it meant to lose someone they had always assumed would stay no matter what. After the adopted child left, the family didn't collapse immediately, in a dramatic way, but the cracks that had long existed began to show more clearly than ever. Without someone in the middle to soften tensions, the conflicts that had been suppressed slowly surfaced. The house looked the same on the outside, but everything inside felt different. Family meals became uncomfortably quiet, not because someone was missing, but because the connection that once existed was gone. The parents began to realize that the stability they thought they had maintained was actually sustained by one person's silent sacrifice. Once that person was no longer there, things didn't naturally improve. Instead, the issues they had long avoided were now exposed, with no one to buffer them. For the first time, the biological child had to face expectations that had previously been softened or redirected. There was no longer a favorable comparison, no one unintentionally carrying responsibility for them, and they began to feel a kind of pressure they had never truly understood before. Small mistakes were no longer easily dismissed, and unresolved issues from the past turned into direct confrontations between them and their parents. But because they weren't used to taking full responsibility, they reacted defensively by explaining, avoiding, or remaining silent. This caused conversations to quickly escalate into tension, and instead of resolving anything, they only widened the gap. The parents, meanwhile, also began to shift their perspective, but the change was neither complete nor immediate. At first, they continued their old habits, trying to minimize, trying to protect, but without the adopted child acting as a balance point, they were forced to face the consequences of their previous choices directly. They started to realize that shielding problems didn't make them disappear, it only delayed them. Questions began to arise, not necessarily spoken aloud, but present in their thoughts. Had they been too biased? Had they overlooked something important? Yet instead of open dialogue, these questions remained unspoken, creating a heavy atmosphere within the household. The fracture was no longer between the two children, it had spread across the entire family dynamic. Everyone could feel the shift, but no one truly knew how to return things to the way they once were, and perhaps that was no longer possible. Most strikingly, the absence of the adopted child began to be felt in ways no one had noticed before. There was no longer someone who quietly handled small responsibilities around the house. No one who stepped in to ease tension when it arose. No one who listened without expecting anything in return. Things that were once taken for granted had now become empty spaces that were difficult to fill. And within those spaces, the parents slowly began to recognize the true value of what they had lost. But recognizing it didn't mean it could be fixed immediately. The distance that had been created was not the result of a single moment, but of a long process. And while they were still trying to understand what had gone wrong, the family had already entered a new phase 1, where everything could no longer rely on old assumptions, but had to confront reality. A reality where not all relationships can be maintained through silence, and not all mistakes can be hidden forever. As the layers of protection gradually disappeared, the biological child entered a phase they had never experienced before facing the consequences of their own actions directly. There was no one left to reshape the narrative, no one to redirect responsibility, and most importantly, no one quietly carrying the burden for them. At first, this shift did not come as a dramatic shock, but as a series of small, yet persistent pressures. Problems that once disappeared quickly, now lingered longer, became more complex, and required them to actively participate in resolving them, instead of standing aside and waiting for a solution. This made them feel a loss of control as things no longer followed the familiar patterns they were used to. When issues arose, whether related to finances, work, or external relationships, they could no longer rely on simple explanations to escape accountability. People outside the family did not view them through the same lens. They had no reason to overlook mistakes and expected clarity and honesty. It was the first time the biological child realized that the world did not operate under the same rules they had grown accustomed to. Within the family, they could delay, avoid, or shift blame, but outside, every action left a trace and carried real consequences. The clash between these two realities created a pressure they did not know how to handle. They tried to maintain their previous image, but the harder they tried, the more their previously hidden weaknesses began to surface. Poorly considered decisions started to result in visible outcomes. A commitment left unfulfilled, a responsibility neglected, a promise broken. Each instance did not only affect the immediate situation, but also influenced how others perceived them. Gradually, they realized that trust was not something that could be sustained by initial impressions. It had to be reinforced through consistent actions. Meanwhile, the parents found themselves in a position of observation, no longer able to intervene as they once had. They wanted to help, but any attempt to step in now risked making the situation more complicated. This forced them to step back and allow their child to face what was happening. It was a difficult experience for both sides. The biological child had to learn accountability without the familiar protection, while the parents had to accept that they could no longer control everything. Conversations between them also changed. Instead of comfort and explanations, there were now more direct questions. How are you going to handle this? Do you understand the consequences of this? But since they were not used to this kind of dialogue, the biological child often responded defensively through silence avoidance or short closed answers. This made the process of change slow and filled with tension. However, within this phase, an important transformation began to take shape, even if gradually. Each time they had to solve a problem on their own, each time they had to face consequences without escape, they slowly understood that responsibility could not be transferred. No one could live their life for them, and no one could continuously fix their mistakes. This realization did not come instantly, but was built through repeated experiences. And while the process was difficult, it was also the first time they truly had the opportunity to learn what it meant to grow. The cost, however, was clear. Consequences that had once been prevented now had to be fully faced. And as they struggled to adapt, the family began to see more clearly the connection between what was happening and how they had raised their child, a connection they had never truly confronted before. The crisis did not arrive like a sudden storm. It formed from small issues that accumulated and eventually collided at a point beyond anyone's control. The family began to feel this clearly when financial pressure and reputational concerns emerged, at the same time creating a spiral that became increasingly difficult to escape. A sum of money that had once been handled casually now became a serious issue requiring explanation. An external relationship, once maintained through promises, now demanded real commitment. Details that once seemed minor were now subjected to close scrutiny. Without the adopted child there to absorb some of the pressure or ease the situation, everything fell directly onto the biological child and the parents. For the first time, they had to face consequences that were not diluted, delayed, or redirected, but present in a direct and undeniable way. The biological child, at the center of it all, began to realize that past mistakes had never truly disappeared. They had only been waiting to return with greater weight. Poor decisions, unfulfilled promises, neglected responsibilities, all now connected into a chain that had to be confronted. But having never been prepared to handle such situations, their response remained defensive, trying to explain, to justify, hoping things could still be minimized. This time, however, there was no one left to soften the impact. External parties demanded clarity and transparency, and they did not accept incomplete answers. The pressure quickly intensified, affecting not only the child, but the entire family. The parents, witnessing the situation escalate, could no longer remain as composed as before. They wanted to intervene, but every step became more complicated as any action could potentially worsen the situation. they began to realize that the methods they had relied on minimizing shield redirecting were no longer effective in this context. Conversations within the family grew more tense, no longer focused on keeping peace, but on how to handle the growing consequences. Yet lacking experience in directly confronting problems, they often fell into cycles of argument and silence. At times, they tried to find solutions only to fall back into old habits. At other times, they recognized the problem, but did not know where to begin changing. Meanwhile, the family's reputation began to be affected in ways they could not control. Questions from outside became more pointed, and relationships that once seemed stable began to weaken. This created a dual pressure managing internal issues while facing external perceptions. In such a situation, every decision became heavier as there were no longer any safe options. Notably, throughout this process, the image of the adopted child, the one who had left, began to reappear in each family member's thoughts, but in a different light. Before, they had been seen as understanding someone who could adapt. Now they were beginning to realize that this person had also been the one holding things together. But this realization did not solve the present crisis. It only made it clear that what they were facing was not a single incident, but the result of a long process. And as everything reached its most intense point, the family was forced to confront a simple but difficult truth. There was no way to return to the way things had been. They could no longer rely on familiar methods, nor could they avoid consequences as before. This crisis was not just about finances or reputation, it was about how they understood and handled responsibility. And from this point forward, every step would no longer be about maintaining outward stability, but about deciding whether they were willing to change and face reality. At a point where everything seemed beyond control, the parents began to clearly feel something they had long avoided. The situation had exceeded their ability to manage it using familiar methods. There were no quick fixes, no explanations that could ease the situation, and most importantly, no one left to carry the burden for them. Pressures from finances, relationships, and reputation had accumulated and now converged, at once leaving them unable to delay or redirect as before. Each passing day brought more direct questions from outside, demanding clearer answers, while inside the family tension continued to rise. The parents realized they were no longer dealing with a single issue, but with the consequences of a long series of choices that had never been fully examined. Yet recognizing this did not mean they knew what to do next. They found themselves in a state of hesitation, wanting to maintain control, but lacking the tools to do so. In their internal discussions, they began considering more concrete solutions: how to handle the financial situation, how to respond to those involved, how to minimize reputational damage. However, every option came with risks, and none guaranteed the outcome they hoped for. This led them for the first time to consider seeking help from outside, a step they had always avoided because it meant admitting they could not solve everything on their own. This decision was not easy, as it challenged their belief that family problems should be handled within the family, but the reality no longer allowed them to hold on to that belief. They began reaching out for advice from experienced individuals, professionals, or trusted connections, and in doing so, they received feedback. They did not expect the problem was not only the current situation, but also the way they had handled things in the past. These observations were not accusatory, but they were enough to make the parents reflect. They realized that their constant attempts to protect had unintentionally created an environment where responsibility was not properly distributed. And when responsibility is misaligned for too long, it returns in the form of crisis. Meanwhile, the biological child also began to notice changes in how the parents approached the situation. There were no longer quick responses aimed at minimizing the problem, but more direct expectations to participate in resolving it, to provide complete information to face consequences. This placed them in an entirely new position, one where they were no longer fully shielded. At first they responded with confusion and defensiveness, but gradually they began to understand that there was no other way to move forward except by engaging directly. This shift was not smooth, but it marked an important change in how the family functioned. For the first time, they began to see the situation, not in terms of maintaining stability, but in terms of addressing it meaningfully. Yet throughout this process, one absence remained constant: the adopted child. No one said it out loud, but everyone understood that if they had been there, things might have been different. Instead of dwelling on that thought, however, the parents began to realize that seeking help was not just about solving the current crisis, but about changing how they would handle challenges in the future. And in the moment they accepted that they could not control everything alone, a new door began to open the door to change, even though much uncertainty still lay ahead. When all familiar solutions proved ineffective, the family began to face a difficult reality. They could no longer overcome this crisis using the same old methods. Their internal discussions gradually shifted from trying to maintain appearances to seeking more meaningful solutions. And in that process, they were forced to consider something they had always avoided: seeking help from outside. At first, the idea was met with hesitation. The parents worried about exposing too much, losing control of the narrative, and how the family would be perceived. But as the pressure continued to grow, they realized that keeping everything hidden was no longer a viable option. Financial issues required professional handling, reputational concerns needed careful management, and most importantly, they needed an objective perspective, one not influenced by emotions or old habits. Seeking support, therefore, was no longer a sign of weakness, but a necessary step to prevent the situation from worsening. As they began engaging with external sources of support, the family experienced a mix of unfamiliarity and discomfort. They were no longer in complete control of the story. Instead, they had to explain, provide information, and at times face direct questions they had never asked themselves before. These questions were not meant to judge, but they highlighted areas the family had overlooked: how they distributed responsibility, how they handled mistakes, and how they had unintentionally created unhealthy patterns. For the parents, this process was both difficult and essential. They started to see the connection between what was happening and their past decisions. Not everything became clear at once, but gradually they realized that overprotection had not prevented mistakes. It had made those mistakes harder to manage when they finally surfaced. Meanwhile, the biological child was also placed in a similar process, though in a different way. Without anyone speaking on their behalf, they had to directly participate in explaining, clarifying, and taking responsibility for what had happened. This initially created pressure and confusion, but it also opened an opportunity they had never had before: the chance to reassess their actions from a different perspective. When faced with specific questions, when required to explain each decision, they began to see the gaps in their thinking and behavior. This was not an immediate transformation, but the beginning of one. Even while still in crisis, the family began to show early signs of adjustment. Conversations became more direct, focusing less on minimizing the situation and more on understanding the root causes and finding solutions. However, this process also revealed another absence: that of the adopted child. In many situations where a balanced perspective or a connecting presence was needed, their absence became evident. No one said it out loud, but the sense of something missing was felt in every decision. And this realization led the parents to reflect more deeply on the role the adopted child once played, a role whose value they had not fully recognized before. But instead of stopping at regret, they began to understand that true change required more than resolving the current crisis. It required changing how they built and maintained relationships within the family. Seeking outside help, therefore, was not just a temporary solution, but the first step in a longer process. A process of learning to confront problems directly, fairly, and responsibly. And although the path ahead remained uncertain, this decision marked an important shift from trying to control everything to accepting the need to change and adapt to reality. As their efforts to manage the crisis began to reach a dead end, a thought slowly emerged within the family, at first faint, but growing clearer over time. They needed to reach out to the adopted child. No one said it immediately, because doing so meant admitting that the person they had once allowed to leave was now the one they needed most. But the more they faced complex problems, the more they realized there were gaps that no one else could fill. The adopted child had not only been the one maintaining balance in the family, but also the one who understood how each member thought, how everything functioned when things were still stable. That understanding made them the only person capable of seeing the full picture in a way the others could not. This thought gradually turned into a decision, though hesitation remained. The parents began to consider how to reach out, whether to call, send a message, or meet in person. Each option carried its own concern. Would the child be willing to listen? Would reaching out now make things worse? They understood that this was not like before when they could easily expect or request support. This time they had to face the possibility of rejection. That realization made them slow down, think more carefully about what they would say and how they would explain themselves. Meanwhile, the biological child also began to recognize the role the adopted child had once played, not through words but through the clear absence now felt. Situations that could once be resolved quickly had become more complicated, not because they were inherently more difficult, but because a balanced perspective was missing. They started to understand that what they once took for granted had actually been the result of someone else's effort. However, this realization came with discomfort, the sense that they had contributed to the distance that now existed. Yet, like the parents, they did not know where to begin to change it. The decision to reach out was finally made, not because they were certain of the outcome, but because they had no clearer alternative. The first call was not like an ordinary conversation. There was a long pause before words were spoken, and when they were, the tone no longer carried authority or expectation but caution. The parents could no longer demand as they once did. They had to present, explain, and most importantly, acknowledge that they needed help. This marked a significant shift from a position of control to one of seeking support. On the other end, the adopted child received the contact under very different circumstances from before. They had had time to step away from old roles to reflect with distance. As a result, their reaction was no longer immediate or purely emotional but measured. They listened not as someone obligated to respond, but as someone with the right to choose. This created a crucial shift in the dynamic of the conversation. For the first time, the relationship was no longer based on assumption, but on willingness. In that moment, the family began to understand that reaching out was not just about solving the problem, but also about confronting how they had treated the adopted child in the past. There was no dramatic apology right away, no complete transformation after a single call. But one thing was clear: they could not continue as before. And the very act of reaching out, though late, opened a new path, one where decisions were no longer driven by old habits but by more conscious choices. After the first call, nothing changed immediately, but a door had been opened, and that alone was enough to shift how everyone began to view the situation. The adopted child did not rush back, nor did they give an immediate answer. They needed time to think not only about what the family needed, but also about whether they were willing to step back into an environment that had once led them to leave. During that time, they reflected on their entire journey, from the days of constantly trying to earn recognition to the moment they chose to leave in order to protect themselves. Those experiences were no longer just painful memories. They had become a foundation for understanding their own worth. Therefore, the decision to return, if any, could not be based on emotion or obligation, but had to be a conscious choice. Meanwhile, the family on the other side was no longer in the same position as before. They could not expect that simply reaching out would bring the child back to fix everything. Waiting became part of the process, a process that forced them to face uncertainty and learn to respect another person's decision. Difficult as it was, this marked an important shift in how they viewed their relationship. When the adopted child finally agreed to meet in person, the meeting did not take place in the familiar setting of the family home, but in a more neutral space where no one held an advantage based on position or role. From the beginning, the adopted child set clear boundaries. They were willing to listen and help within their capacity, but they would not return to their previous role. This was not said confrontationally, but calmly, and it was enough for everyone to understand that things had changed. The family, hearing this, did not react as they might have. Before, there was no denial or pressure, but a thoughtful silence. They realized that if they wanted help, they would have to accept new conditions and respect boundaries they had previously overlooked. The conversation that followed was no longer about right or wrong, but about understanding the current situation. The adopted child listened to every detail, asked questions, and gradually formed a complete picture: financial issues, external pressures, internal conflicts. But instead of offering immediate solutions, they took time to analyze, ensuring that any decisions would not only address the current situation, but also prevent repeating past mistakes. This created a new rhythm in how the family approached problems: slower, but more intentional. The biological child in that meeting also faced the adopted child differently. There was no longer a dynamic defined by roles, but a conversation between two individuals who had both changed. They could no longer remain silent as before, because the context had shifted. Though it was not easy, they began to engage more directly, explaining, listening, and at times acknowledging things they had never said before. This was a small but significant step, marking a shift from avoidance to confrontation. The return of the adopted child, therefore, was not the return of someone who would fix everything, but the presence of someone with clarity and defined boundaries. The family, though still in crisis, began to find a new kind of support, not based on sacrifice, but on cooperation. And it was this shift that opened the possibility for a different path, one where each person was responsible for their own part, rather than relying on one individual to keep everything from falling apart. When the adopted child began participating in addressing the crisis, the first thing they did was not to offer solutions, but to clarify what had long been overlooked. Truth and responsibility had to be placed where they belonged. This sounded simple, but it was the most significant shift for the family. In the past, they were used to minimizing situations, finding the quickest way out, and if necessary, letting one person carry the burden for everyone else. But this time, that approach was no longer acceptable. The adopted child established a clear principle from the start. Every issue had to be understood for what it truly was, and each person had to take responsibility for their part. This initially created tension, as it forced everyone to confront things they had long avoided. The biological child, faced with this expectation, had no choice but to engage directly in resolving the situation. They had to present the full story, clarify their decisions, and most importantly, acknowledge mistakes that had previously been downplayed. This process was not easy. There were moments when they still tried to explain things in a way that protected themselves, but this time the questions from the adopted child did not allow the conversation to remain superficial. They had to go deeper, revisit details, and gradually recognize the connection between past actions and present consequences. This realization did not come all at once, but with each confrontation of the truth, they moved closer to understanding their responsibility. Meanwhile, the parents also had to adjust their role. They were no longer directing the narrative or protecting one side, but participating in understanding and resolving the issue. This required them to listen more, to accept perspectives that differed from their own. There were moments of discomfort, as not everything said was easy to hear. But instead of rejecting it, they began to learn how to accept it slowly but clearly. The adopted child in this new role did not try to control or impose, but acted more as a facilitator. They helped clarify information, connect different aspects, and most importantly, kept the conversation from slipping back into old habits. When someone tried to avoid responsibility, they brought the discussion back to focus. When a problem was minimized, they reminded everyone of its real impact. This was not about creating pressure, but about ensuring that decisions were based on full understanding. Gradually, the family began to see the effectiveness of this approach. Issues that once seemed tangled became clearer when broken down into parts. Responsibilities that had overlapped were now properly defined. And most importantly, everyone began to understand that facing the truth, no matter how difficult, was the only way forward. The biological child, after repeated involvement in this process, began to shift their perspective. They were no longer focused solely on avoiding consequences, but started thinking about solving problems. This marked a critical change, showing that they were moving away from old habits and learning to take genuine responsibility. The parents witnessing this change realized that letting go of their previous protective approach was not a loss, but an opportunity for their child to grow. And throughout this process, the role of the adopted child became clearer than ever, not as someone who carried the burden for others, but as someone who helped restore balance. It was this shift that gradually allowed the family to move out of the crisis, not by avoiding it, but by confronting and adjusting. And for the first time in a long while, they began to see the possibility of resolving problems in a sustainable way where no one had to sacrifice themselves to keep everything intact. As the final knots of the crisis were gradually untangled, the family did not return to what it once was, but moved into an entirely new phase, one where relationships were rebuilt on understanding and responsibility rather than habit. The adopted child, who had once left in silence, did not return as someone who would fix everything, but stood in a new position, grounded, clear, and self-defined. They no longer needed to prove they deserved to belong, because their journey had already done that. The greatest change was not in how the family saw them, but in how they saw themselves. They understood that their worth did not depend on anyone's approval but on their own choices and how they faced challenges. As the crisis settled, conversations within the family also changed. There were no longer avoided truths or unspoken expectations, but more direct and sincere exchanges. The parents, after everything, began to show acknowledgement not through grand apologies, but through listening and adjusting their behavior. They no longer placed the adopted child in the role of sacrificing for harmony, but respected the boundaries that had been set. For the adopted child, this meant more than any words could express. The biological child also underwent a clear transformation. Without the familiar protection, they began to rebuild how they approached problems step by step. There were still mistakes, but the difference was that they no longer avoided them, they addressed them. In the process, the relationship between the two children began to shift. It was no longer defined by comparison or competition, but by a mutual respect shaped through experience. They did not become perfect, but they began to understand each other in a more realistic way. For the adopted child, the ending was not about returning to the way things were, but about moving forward from a new position, one where they had the right to choose how connected they wanted to be to the family. They were no longer bound by the obligation to please everyone, but could decide when to engage and when to step back. This did not create distance. Instead, it made every interaction more genuine. The family no longer relied on their sacrifice to maintain stability, but learned to stand on their own responsibilities. And that shift created a stronger foundation for the future. The adopted child also began building a life of their own, in ways they had never had the chance to before. Free from old roles, they explored new possibilities, formed relationships based on mutual respect, and gradually created a space where they truly belonged. The family, though still imperfect, remained, but now as part of their life, not the entirety of it. Most importantly, they no longer felt they had to choose between belonging and being themselves. The story ends not with a dramatic moment, but with a lasting transformation. Each person learns to face their own responsibilities, and their relationships are no longer built on favoritism or silence, but on understanding and choice. For the adopted child, it is a fortunate ending, not because everything becomes perfect, but because they finally find their own worth and can move forward without losing themselves. And that is the true resolution, not only for the family but for them as well.